Hey witches, Tiffany here on Bewitching.Bemused. Today we're going to cover an introduction to knot magic. So you've probably heard knot magic, cord magic, string magic, witches' rosaries, witches' ladders. Now, these are all related terms for a similar set of practices which involve casting spells by using string, ribbon, twine, cords, etc., thread, etc., and working an intention into each knot, stitch, or weave. Part of what I find so empowering and so captivating about knot magic is that when you look into mythology from all around the world, you will find mythological characters and deities who weave themselves, and they will use weaving in order to create destinies, to weave fate, to weave magic. In practice, witches' ladders date back to at least the Middle Ages. Ribbons and string and twine have been discovered inside the walls of homes, sometimes having feathers and bone and twigs and other items tied onto them to create the witch's ladder. And nowadays, while yes, the witch's ladder and that description is one version of knot magic, it is really hard to do an introductory video, as we will find as I go along here, because the use and the execution of knot magic is so vast. However, in every incarnation of this practice, one thing always holds true, and that is that every knot or every stitch holds an intention and holds power. Just to touch upon a few of the forms that knot magic can take, I first want to talk about witches' ladders, because I do feel like this single string knotted witch's ladder is probably one of the most popular and most commonly known nowadays, especially because you'll see it on Pinterest, on Instagram, on Reddit, and all these different places, little memes that will say, you know, take a string this long and tie the first knot. And with that first knot, you would say, you know, by knot of one, my spell's begun. By knot of two, I call to you. By knot of three, you think of me. And, you know, that might lead into more for something like an attraction spell. That is pretty much the basis of these. It is a string or ribbon or cord with a series of knots, and an incantation is spoke with each knot. It doesn't always have to rhyme, but that's typically the gist of it. A lot of times the number of knots or the distance between the knots or the length of the cord or the color of the cord is going to correspond with the overall intention. So the difference between this one and a lot of other forms of knot magic is a lot of times you have one intention and you are just repeating that intention as you go with every knot. Whereas with this one, you have different bits of the same intention, right? So the one I was just kind of reciting and coming up with was, you know, the intention for that could possibly be, you know, so-and-so is attracted to me. And so, or so-and-so thinks of me often, right? That would be the intention. So instead of thinking that with every single knot, you were thinking an incantation that leads up to that ultimate intention. Now, another form of the witch's ladder is the braided witch's ladder. This one's a little bit different. You usually only have two knots, one at the top and then one at the end to fasten it. And in between is going to be a braid. And what I love about this form is you use the braiding process to focus on your intention. Again, your knots are very intentional as well, but as you're braiding, it's just sort of a, you know, it's this really rhythmic tasks that you can do without really thinking, and it allows you to get into sort of a trance state or a state of gnosis. One way to mix up both of these versions is, in addition to having your knots or your braid, you can also work in slips of paper, you can work in twigs, charms, feathers, beads, leaves, twigs, etc., kind of whatever works with it and corresponds along with your intention. The reason that I shared those two particular versions is because, like I said, the first one is probably one of the most popular versions of the witch's ladder and of basic knot magic. And the second one, the braid, is just my personal favorite. I really enjoy using it to achieve that state of gnosis, probably because of my experience with chaos magic. But there are so many different ways that you can practice knot magic. You can do it through hair braiding, creating friendship bracelets or other types of jewelry, macrame, hand sewing, machine sewing, knitting, crocheting, weaving, cross stitch, needlepoint, and this gets left out a lot, I feel like, but if you have a partner who is consenting and down for it and you're both interested in doing this safely, you can also incorporate knot magic into sex magic through bondage and rope work. So you can see there's all these different versions, which is partly why it's so difficult to do an introductory video on this, because I can't sit here and go over each and every one. But again, just know that the whole point is to weave intention into whatever it is you're doing, whether you're knotting, whether you're stitching, you are putting your intention into that work. Just as there are dozens of ways to practice knot magic, there are probably just as many ways to actually use it in your craft, but here are some of the most popular ways. So the first one is to use it as a spell in itself. So that first example of the witch's ladder, where you're reciting your incantation as you are knotting the string, that is a good example of that. Just the performance of creating that is in and of itself a spell. Typically with this, the creation or use of your knot magic piece is the spell itself. The creation of it is performing the spell, and then afterwards you might tuck it away, you might hide it, you might burn it, you might give it to somebody, so on. Next, it might also be used to enchant an item. So sometimes, or actually a lot of the time, knot magic is used to create a full item that will then be used. One example of this would be to create a home blessing quilt. And while you're needle pointing, you know, each square, or you're stitching it together, that's your intention, is to bless the home, create a warm, comfortable atmosphere. Or you might weave a friendship bracelet to enhance your friendship, to strengthen your friendship. You might knit a baby blanket for protection, and so on. Another use for knot magic is in ritual use. Oftentimes in this situation, the ribbon or cords, what have you, will be prepared in advance, whether that's for knotting or braiding them together. They will usually be blessed in advance, and then they'll be used for something like an initiation. Some initiations do require binding. It just sort of depends on the group and what their particular practices and what their traditions are. Or it can also be used for something like a hand fasting during a marriage ceremony. Those are just a couple of examples for ritual use, though I'm sure there's more. And finally, there are meditational cords. So these are usually created and used in devotion to a particular deity, although not always. They're typically used to focus during concentration. It's very similar to when you see maybe a Catholic praying with a rosary. So each bead on a rosary kind of marks a certain point. And so when you're working with meditational cords, it's sort of a similar concept. So I once heard it described as each knot is sort of a guidepost as you're kind of doing, I guess, traveling through trance work is the best way to describe it. So yeah, it's really hard to go into further detail on that one without it's a very personal process, and sometimes it's very specific to certain traditions or certain covens. So that one's, sorry if it's a little confusing, just know that it's meditational as well, often for trance work or for deity devotion. Finally, I would love to tell you how to make your own, but like I said, this is so varied. So you have to decide on your own if you want to just stick with a simple string spell, knotted string spell to create a witch's ladder, if you want to do something braided, if you want to, if maybe you knit or you crochet or you sew or you macrame, that, you know, those are all valid ways of practicing knot magic. So that is really up to you. I just do have a few tips of things that you might want to keep in mind. There are a lot of associations for you to consider. Certain things you might be limited on. For instance, if you're, the materials that you're working with, if you're knitting a sweater versus sewing an evening gown, the materials you use, you might be kind of limited on what you're allowed to pick from, but it is one thing that you can always kind of consider what your associations are. But if you are just creating, say, a witch's ladder for the sake of performing knot magic, you do have some more wiggle room. You can kind of decide if you want natural materials, synthetic materials, which ones you want. You know, is it twine, leather, cotton, silk, wool? I mean, there's so many out there, and you can kind of consider what those mean to you. You know, ribbon, like a lacy ribbon might be very elegant, whereas twine is more of an earthy. So think about what really works for your intention. Along those same lines, you also want to consider colors, color associations. Obviously, very, very important as well. Again, you might be limited. If a friend has requested, can you make my baby a bright pink blanket because I'm going to have a girl, like, then yeah, you may not be able to pick the color on that, but that doesn't mean that you can't still, work your intentions into it. But where you do have wiggle room to get creative on your own, I would say go for it. Work in those color color correspondences. And then finally, numbers as well. Number associations you can do a lot with in Not Magic, in both regard to, oh gosh, okay, how many knots you do, how many stitches you do, the length of what you're working with, how many pieces of cord or twine or string that you're working with, how far apart each knot is or each stitch is. So there's a lot of ways to work in, and don't overwhelm yourself. Don't think that you have to have every single thing correspond with your intention, the color, the material, and the length, and how many knots you do and how far apart they are. And you're going to take a ruler and measure how big the knot is in millimeters and make sure that it's matching up. Like, just don't, oh man, that's too much. And again, with all of those associations, it's, that's a little bit easier to control with something like a witch's ladder versus if you're following a sewing pattern. So again, don't fret too much. Just do as much as you can. But finally, you should plan ahead as much as possible. Again, if you're doing something like a sewing pattern, then yeah, you have to know how many yards of fabric you need, what type of fabric you need matching thread to go with the fabric. It's a whole trip to the store, and then you got to cut out the pattern. And anyway, that's a whole lot of prep work. But even if you're just taking a piece of string and tying knots into it, you should know how many knots you're going to do, what each knot is going to mean, what you're going to be visualizing and focusing on, and perhaps saying aloud while you are tying that knot. It's all about the planning in advance. Could you do this on a whim? Sure, but I think it's going to be a lot more impactful if you really use this to stay focused. So you can focus more on your trance work. You have everything prepared in advance, so you can just kind of zone out, reach that point of trance, point of gnosis, and just focus on doing what you're doing, As always with any spell, every single action, every single movement, and every single word should have a purpose, and you should know what it is. I love hearing about creative pursuits, so please down below leave a comment telling me how you incorporate Not Magic into your craft and into your daily life. If you're looking for some more ways to get creative in your practice, you can check out this video right here.